Good afternoon.
Today, here with Mansell Upham. Today, I'm here with Mansell Upham, who is a specialist in the history of the early Cape. And he has done a lot of work on the genealogy and the background of the early settlers, as well as activism in the 90s with the Griqua identity movement. He runs a blog, which I believe is pronounced Mautse, and it contains a variety. Sorry,
Muatse.
how did you pronounce it?
Muatse.
Moatse. Moatse. Okay. So, is there anything that you'd add to that description of yourself?
Yes. Actually, you just mentioned that I've focused on the settlers, not so much the settlers, but on all the early colonial inhabitants of the Cape, especially with regard to the slaves and, of course, the indigenous population. So my main concern there was looking at, because it was a small microcosm in the 17th century, it was obvious for me anyhow that this was a perfect case study to look at the entire colonial population individually and to give them names, because a lot of the people, of course, have become forgotten. But the records, thanks to the Dutch were very keen record keepers, for better or for worse. But luckily for us, very helpful, because we have more information than what we could have expected. I think the British were not half as good as the Dutch in terms of record keeping, but we have this wealth of colonial record keeping, which means that we can identify almost each and every person. And then it becomes, of course, not just a genealogical study, but it becomes a social study where you can actually see the whole community. So, yeah, like kicking open an ant heap and looking at the whole colony squirm and move around and having this overview, very fascinating study. So that has been, 40 years of endless fascination, I should say. And of course, the indigenous aspect, because I have over the years discovered my own indigenous ancestry, and quite recent too, the ancestry that is, discovery not so recent. I discovered that already when I was in high school, 1977. 17 years old at that point. But so the importance of, or the realization rather, of having indigenous ancestry and the implications of that, of course, led me into a whole new understanding of, where I was supposed to fit into the grand scheme of things. And, I say this not flippantly, but growing up in South Africa was never easy. I was born in Welkom in the Orange Free State with a very, very English name, first name and family name. And frankly, most of my life I've been told to go back to England. And I've been told in no uncertain terms throughout my life that I don't belong. So I have never accepted this. In fact, I vehemently reject this rejection. And my whole study has been because of that. I've been like, where the hell do I fit in? And why is it that I am being told that I should not be here? So, I have a pretty good idea of who's who in the zoo in terms of the 17th century, especially. So the main reason why I focused on the first 50 years of Dutch colonization was to cover the period of Griqua's life. So Griqua being the Cape indigene who married the Danish surgeon Peter Meerhof from Copenhagen. These are my double ancestors. My mother and father both descend from her. And her life story, of course, is tragic and very, very complex. And I've always felt that it was too sensitive a story to fully comprehend unless I literally uncovered all the people that were alive at the same time as she was in the colony, and to try and understand the dynamics and to try and get a fuller picture of her life. And I'm still doing that. I'm still not ready to actually write her story up, because I feel that to do it prematurely will only be a disservice to her life story. So
Yes, no, I feel a little bit of ground here because my family also very genealogy. One of the books behind me, slightly out of shot here, is an incredibly fat book on the history of the Retiefs in Wellington, who my father comes from, and
your father or your mother?
a few hundred years, of course. My side. I mean, I know my surname isn't Retief, but the biggest family. It's the part of the family we most fit into. And I mean, we also like most white South Africans, we also share ancestry with Eva Kratoa, and yeah, it's the other thing is being English when you grow up in Wellington, kind of a bit. I mean, it's not that alien as growing up in Welkom, but you get a little bit of shtick from the Afrikaners.
No, I didn't grow up in Welkom.
Oh, right.
I was born there. You know, my father was in the gold mines, so we moved around a lot. So, you know, I grew up all over the place. It's also in Mozambique. But the latter part of my childhood was in the Cape, you know, so that, and my you know, coming back to the Cape was for me the real coming back, because my mother was a true Kaapenaar, and it was finally, you know, when my father left Anglo American and decided to set up his own business, then we relocated to the Cape, and that was for me a whole new world that had opened. I'd come home. And, you know, I'm very passionate. The Cape for me is the center of the universe. And, you know, I don't know if you know the book on the Native Americans, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I've always felt that, you know, my heart should be buried at Bloberg.
Yes, I'm aware.
That's where my family is from. So, you know, that would be my wish. Bury my heart at Bloberg Strand. Yeah. But, yeah, the...
well, speaking of which...
if you're Retief on your mother's side, is that right? Your mother's a Retief, is she not?
My father's father, my mother, very, very English. My grandmother was Retief. Your grandmother. Yes.
So your father, right. So, yeah. So you probably, well, undoubtedly, you would be related to me on, well, countless times. And you know, this is the other aspect. The amount of inbreeding is so incredible. It is quite unique for the Cape. And, you know, this straddles English-speaking, Afrikaans-speaking whites and so-called Cape Coloureds. So we all come together. We all share the same ancestors. And this is the crucial thing. And that's why when you said settlers, I kind of blanched, because most of our female ancestors were not so white. Hence the blanching, right? Yeah. So, no. We were, you know, most of our ancestors, our male ancestors were sucking at the memories of slave women and indigenous women. And this is why we feel so rooted. It's important. It's very, very important to embrace that part of our history. You're smiling as if this is amusing stuff, but it's pretty serious. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, but I mean, it's. Look, I mean, I don't smile because it's something to look down on. I think it's quite lovely. It's you do have an excuse to be here, you know what I mean?
Well, yes, you know, I think ultimately it's that final, you know, validation, you know, such an American term, but so you feel validated, and when you're being attacked from all sides, it's time to fight back and say, hell no, you know, take that. Actually, I am more Hottentot than any of you can wish to be. And, you know, there are some incredible ironies. When I researched the first boatload of slaves from West Africa, I discovered that most of their descendants are white South Africans, so-called whites, who were classified white under apartheid. And the majority of those slaves were shipped off to Batavia, to Jakarta today. And, well, not shipped today, but to Batavia, which is now Jakarta today. And anyway, so the few that were kept at the Cape, and the few
hang on a second. So you're saying white South Africans? Sorry,
yes.
You're saying that Africans were captured as slaves and sent to?
No. I'm saying West African. West African slaves were. There were two. There was a boatload from Benin, and one which is Old Dahomey, and there was one captured Portuguese prize off the coast of Brazil of Angolan slaves. So you had slaves from Guinea, so-called West Africa,
Okay.
Guinea or Benin more specifically. So that ship went to purchase and brought back a boatload. And the captured Portuguese prize brought back a boatload of Angolan waifs, children, mostly children. But most of them were, that survived and it could arrive alive and well at the Cape. They were then separated, and the best ones were shipped off to Jakarta. And the few that remained behind at the Cape, half of them, if not more, died from the winter, and they were, very weak. And the few that survived were incorporated into the white colonial society, and are founding mothers of many Afrikaner families, and subsequently also Cape Coloured families.
Well, that's interesting.
There's this incredible, you can take back and most white South Africans, English, Afrikaans speaking, and Cape Coloured you can take back their ancestry to a handful of these women from West Africa, from Guinea and from Angola. But the irony is that the majority of them are actually amongst the so-called white population. So, yeah, West African and Angolan, Central African blood that's very, very prominent. Families like Kruger. There's so many. The Kruger family. Actually, the Kruger families I should talk about separately. But the most famous one would be the who was it? The Steyn family, and of course our famous Credo van een Afrikaner, Dr. Jenert. His family descend from this bunch as well. And of course they could, they could have known if they wanted to know. And accusations often, it's now claimed that these people deliberately hid the past, and it was suppressed, and it was smothered and hidden, censored. Records were. This is not true. None of that happened. It's more a case of a very, very messy history. A lot of women lose their name on marrying, so the female line gets forgotten. Of course, it's a patriarchal society, so yes, and history hasn't been kind to ordinary people. And this is why, when it comes to the question of decolonization, if we are looking at our history, we have to bear in mind that a lot of our history has only recently come to the fore. The history of the poor people, the history of the common people, the history of women. These have all been not suppressed, but kind of sidelined, marginalized, whatever, whatever historical cliche or academic cliche you want to use. These people have been missed out. And of course, politically, they have been brought back into the fold. So if we are going to decolonize, then we need to realize that even amongst the whites, a lot of the history wasn't suppressed, but it's just hasn't been looked at. Because history was all about victors and about famous people and rich people. So, no one was looking at the slaves. Nobody was looking at the ordinary ordinary people who had no political influence, and of course, if they were uneducated, they were not considered either. So the good thing about the micro history and tracking each and every individual, you have a better idea of how the society evolved.
I see. And one of the things that I would pick up on here is for most people, Cape, it's I don't think that everyone has a very clear idea of what the society really look. So the little things that sort of seem like little factoids, I think, paint a very picture. I mean, it's very small, see numerically, very small compared to today. Completely different. The everyday object completely different. The way that they measure things would be completely different from the currents. And if you were to give a sort of overview of those sort of small and the people that you would see, how would you describe the Cape in this period?
Well, actually, I would say that the Cape should rather. What has happened with South Africa's isolation, especially under apartheid, I think we developed a kind of a sakoku, like the Japanese isolation. We were cut off. historically.
Okay.
There was no, but the Suez Canal, of course, hadn't been built, so we still had traffic going around the continent, fortunately for us. And that, of course, made for the cosmopolitan nature of Cape Town and made it a global center. And we shouldn't forget that. But we have forgotten it because, the Suez Canal and apartheid isolation has kind of reinforced the sense of we're at the bottom of Africa and we were never really connected with the rest of the world. But that's absolutely not true. We were so connected. Which means that, although we were a Dutch colony, we were actually, influenced by everything that was happening with all the shipping going round the Cape and back. And the connections are incredible because, the Dutch were trading on an artificial island off Nagasaki, Dejima, which means exit island in Japanese. And Van Riebeeck was there. Wagenaar, the second Cape commander, he served on Dejima. The last Dutch opperhoofd or superintendent of Dejima was born in Cape Town. He's a family member. He's a descendant of Angela from Bengal, the third slave to be freed at the Cape, who's the founding mother of the Basson family, my grandmother's family. So they all had connections with Japan. It's no wonder that we eat nachis. Nachis are from Japan. And mikang is a Japanese fruit. And we wear a yapon, which is a yukata. We wear a Japanese gown. In Afrikaans, it's called a japon, not for, for an obvious reason. People were wearing these things at that time. They were wearing Japanese clothing. There was a Japanese slave at the Cape in 1661. There were 2 commanders that had served it in Japan. These were well-traveled people. The second commander at the Cape was, Van Riebeeck himself was in Greenland. He was in Tonking in Vietnam. He was in Japan and, of course, Batavia, or Indonesia. And then, of course, Wagenaar, the second commander, who was German from Dresden, he was in Brazil as well, and Suriname. And then he came, he was in Japan, he was in Indonesia as well. So you've got, these people were cutting across, the different continents. And these were highly, highly cultured people, especially people like Wagenaar, who was a well-seasoned Dutch East India official. And also another important thing is, we became a colony in 1652. That was very, very late in the Dutch East India Company's history. We were one of the last of their outposts. So by the time we were colonized, we were tapping into quite a network, which was very well established. So, this idea of people just arrived at the Cape and stayed and never left again is not true. There were people coming and going, even slaves that were enslaved and shipped to the Cape and got their freedom. Some of them opted to go back east again. And you've got these wonderful stories. I'm working now on a paper of an ancestor. She's one of the most interesting people I've encountered. She was an Angolan slave, so she was part of the Portuguese prize. So she was captured on this, basically it was a Portuguese ship that was attacked by the Dutch, and they took half of the cargo, which were slaves. They had to leave the other half behind because there wasn't enough place on the ship. And they took half of the slaves, mostly children, the best ones, and they took them back to the Cape. And she was about 6 years old when she arrived at the Cape. And she then becomes a very important figure because she was a fruitvrouw, a midwife. And midwives have a very powerful position because they are sworn to secrecy. Their testimony is valid in a court of law under Roman Dutch law. So they had to, of course, observe the coming into the world of the infant, and they had to speak for the mother. And if the child was illegitimate, etc., the father had to be outed, identified, and made to contribute to because the Dutch were, of course, very focused on welfare and containing poverty. So they were very, very advanced at that stage in terms of looking after the poor and preventing further poverty. So she was, being a midwife, she was then at one stage singled out by some rather high-ranking VOC official whose wife was pregnant, and she was taken to Batavia. And once she had, accompanied them, she was promised her freedom, and she was shipped back to Cape Town. And then she had the temerity to address the Council of Policy and say, "Excuse me, I was promised my freedom, and you will free me." and she was freed. She became a free burger, a burgeresse. She, for some strange reason, but perhaps not so strange, she opted to go back into the slave lodge as a free person, but rather she withdrew from free society and rejoined the slaves. I suspect the reason being that one of her children had escaped either by ship, stowing away, or by fleeing into the interior. But she had other children who were still slaves, and she had children that had been freed. So she was kind of torn between two worlds. But I think her greatest act of emancipation was to actually say, thank you for freeing me, but no thank you. I'd rather go back into slavery. So I think her story needs to be told because it raises so many questions.
That is an extremely bizarre story.
And this is a woman who, went from Angola to almost to Brazil, back across the Atlantic, back to Cape Town, then across the Indian Ocean to Jakarta, and all the way back. So she got around. This Angolan, and she died at the ripe old age of 80. And she is mentioned, she's one of the few slaves that gets a special mention when she dies, because she was so part of the community. And of course, she was given the honorary title of mother, the Portuguese Mai. And I'm very proud to say that she's an ancestor of a great many white South Africans and other South Africans. Her progeny is vast, to say the least. And if we're talking 12, 13, 14 generations, we're talking a few thousand people at least, living people that would be direct descendants.
Yeah. Now, I know that for some time taking slaves from the native population was forbidden, and interference in native was considered, something that was not done. But at what did sort of violations of this begin? Because we know that there were several who were eventually taken. Okay,
so the indigenous population were never legally enslaved, and nowadays with the political discourse, they tend words like rape and theft are being used too broadly, and I think we have to get back to their legal meanings, because it's very important to understand that, because being a legal slave meant that you were registered as property, like land. It was a real right that you had of ownership over that person, and they had to be registered, and they could be ceded and sold and alienated legally. But this was all done on paper, like any other legal possession, like land that had to be registered. So the indigenous population were never subjected to that kind of legal constraints, shall we say. Of course, once the Bushmen were being slowly but surely eradicated, because being hunter-gatherers and a real threat to the stock farmers in terms of losing their stock, which was vital to the company to feed the passing ships. What we also forget is that the whole of the Western Cape and the Northern Cape were vast open land that was used for feeding the cattle and the sheep. And everyone was making money out of that, including the colonial Hottentots, so-called, the indigenous, so we say the indigenes that were incorporated into the colony. And of course, the breakdown of the indigenous population is complicated. We're dealing with not just the smallpox epidemic of 1713, but the kind of attrition that was taking place. It was, there was a lot of divide and rule, instigated by the Dutch and by the indigenous people themselves. So there was a lot of infighting, and so a lot of these tribes were one was being played off the other, and more and more were becoming incorporated into the colony. And of course, the ones that were outside were then raiding and stealing, and I think the rover was the word the Dutch like to use a lot, die roverende Busmans, and they'd say Hottentot Bushmen as well. And it's hard to tell in the records who's Hottentot and who's Bushman, because often it could be Khoi who were had lost their livestock and they'd become Bushmanized. So you even had Khoi people who became Bushmen in terms of lifestyle and survival style. But the so the loss, the Khoi were very, very aware of their freedom until quite late in the history. So you had, if there were Bushman raids and the commanders attacked, we have on record children that were taken or rescued from, depending on whose perspective you're looking at, that were brought into the fold of the colonial system and then were indentured. So of course the Dutch were very hard on, if you owed money, you had to pay it back. And if you owe, so nobody got off that easily. There was always, but nothing's changed. We have mortgage bonds, we have loans, and this whole question of debt bondage.
We don't take your children away from mortgage bonds, though.
Sure. But this shows you the evolution of how human beings have come to value human dignity. So we have to see this in the context of the evolution of legal rights. And I think we don't often do that. We just assume that everything should be like it is today. But certainly, I mean, debt bondage and selling people or selling your services was common and a real problem. So the indentured, white people were being indentured as well. And effectively, if you were part of the VOC, you belonged to them until they set you free. And hence, we have this rather bizarre situation where you've got this global company that gets a license to go out and colonize with an army and with the imprimatur of the Prince of Orange and of the States General, of the Dutch Parliament, of the new Dutch Republic, and saying, go and colonize. It's all yours. You can do what you like. And having people that they were giving freedom to. It's just bizarre. But of course, it raises all kinds of questions. Yes.
So how the status of indenture for these into the East Indies, particular nature was that, and the penalties for violating those that status.
You had all kinds of one aspect that I'm looking at the moment, which has been completely neglected, and that is young boys that were in the serving as boys on the ships. You had 9-year-old boys, even younger, who were part of the labor force, and there's very little. So this is how, like, the first Kluti, Jacob Kluti, he came out with his son, but his son was on a different ship as one of the boys. He was a powder monkey, I suppose. I think that's a term that I've happened on recently. These were young boys that had to carry the gunpowder, right, and run between, and they're small, so they can move quickly on the decks. But you can imagine this. There's all kinds of things in the records where these boys were being sexually abused, and then we have court cases and we have testimonies. Fascinating stuff. There's so much that needs to be uncovered and unearthed, and we should stop with the decolonization. Let's first find out what really happened to all these people. Then we can talk about dignity, and then we can talk about how terrible our history has been for everyone, frankly.
It's neat. So, I mean, I've done my own little videos in South Africa, sort of one on just trying to describe the little folkways of each group. A thought struck me, because slavery is fairly universal as a pre-modern human institution, and I wondered if any of the blacks. Turns out that there's a very tiny number of papers that have been produced by, I think, 3 scholars on slavery done by black South Africans in the pre-colonial period, and it turns out to have been fairly ordinary and fairly extensive as well. And I was surprised to notice that how little attention this has gotten. you're talking about, much of that early family history in the Cape is completely overlooked. Anything that into any kind of political narrative seems to just evaporate.
Mm-hmm. So, you were talking about the indigenous people being enslaved, and as I said, they were mostly indentured, and that seemed to have happened more from the middle of the 1700s. But certainly, I have a great grandfather who was a bastard Hottentot, and bastard Hottentots were simply, well, you had bastards who had a white father and a Khoi mother, and a bastard Hottentot would normally be a slave father and, of course, a Khoi mother. And being the mother being Khoi meant that the child was born in freedom. And this is very important. These people were never slaves. And they knew it. They knew they were vrijgeboren. And they had rights. And what's so interesting is when you start looking at the opening of the frontier, as it expanded northwards and, of course, eastwards, you start seeing how these mixed race bastards and Bastaarde Hottentotten were being used as at the forefront. They were the trackers. They were the people that opened up the frontier. And they were the people that were used in the commandos as trackers and as locals who knew the landscape and who could, of course, help expand the colony. So they were collaborators, and they were certainly part of the colonial equation. So, like my great-great-great-great-grandfather, he was given land in 1813 after the Battle of Louwburg, when the Brits came and introduced more liberal ideas. That didn't stop them from using the Hottentot core. So what actually happened was, once the Hottentots were broken up, they were then kind of put into the mostly Genadendal and Marmary, into the traditional areas, very similar to the apartheid thinking, and a reservation of sorts, the American term, and of course, finally they were allowed to get the missionaries in, because the Dutch Reformed Church had no interest in proselytizing the indigenous people. They tried at the beginning and they gave up very quickly as a waste of time and not in their interest. For some very interesting aspect too, that the Reformed faith was so unwilling, yet it was so active in Asia at the same time. So another aspect that really needs to be fully investigated.
So why did they not proselytize?
Well, I think it's because the cultural differences were so, you're dealing with a hunter-gatherer and you're dealing with so nomadic people. And I think what was happening, these people, just to give you an example, something that really struck me was one quote of one European visitor at the Cape who observed that the Khoi were very unimpressed with the sea dogs, as the white people were known as the sea dogs, so pejorative term from the indigenous side. The sea dogs the sea dogs are slaves to time. Very interesting observation, slaves to time. And the Europeans were like, what do you mean? Well, why do you guys work, and why do you follow the clock? Our women do everything for us. So this is always my warning to people. Think very carefully if you want to decolonize. You may very well get what you wish for, and you might, if that's your idea of regressing back into a primeval protoplasmic kind of, a noble savage scenario, then yes, you're going to have the men lying around doing sweet Fanny Adams, and the women doing all the work. So goodbye feminism, goodbye women's rights. Very interesting. But so you can imagine these, the mindset is so different. Like, we don't work. You people are slaves to time. We are not interested in being converted. And, the few cases that, of course, a huge case can be made for Griqua. She was the living example, the experiment that failed, that went horribly wrong. And I think the church after that, had a serious had serious reservations about tackling the conversion problem. So And then the smallpox epidemic too, 1713, wiped out most of the Western Cape people, the ones that, and only few were left behind. So not so much reason to convert them, I suppose. But it's interesting because the slaves were baptized. All the company slaves were baptized from birth. First, the half caste, the mixed race ones, and then later on, in terms of the Synod of Dort, they finally conceded that even slaves who did not have white blood should also be baptized at birth as infants. And that was very, and of course, the private slave owners didn't do this, but the company certainly did. So there was a double standard there as well. So the private owners, of course, didn't want to baptize their slaves because there was the law at the time was such that if you baptized a slave, you could not alienate the slave legally. So once a slave was baptized, they could not be resold. So that was also, one's got to remember, same as, by way of analogy, the British system of primogeniture with the royal family. Princess Anne's children don't have any titles, and they have become commoners, right? And Prince Edward has a lower rank title than his brother Andrew or his brother Charles. So the royal family basically gets watered down, and only the eldest son inherits and the titles. So you don't have this overinflated aristocracy like you had in Germany, where everyone was a princess or everyone was a count or a countess. Every brother, every sister, every cousin kept the title. So in terms of slavery, there were rules that basically said, if you are half caste, you can get your freedom after so many years. And if you are full blood, then you have to work longer, but then you can also retire and get your freedom. And it was also practiced of many slave owners had their Christian conscience, so they felt that it was their Christian duty to free their slaves when they died. So there were many testamentary manumissions. Of course, the slave owners would have done this also to assuage their conscience. Because there's no doubt in my mind that Europeans had a bad conscience about slavery, because slavery had been abolished in Europe by the time the Dutch started introducing slavery at the Cape. But when the Dutch went east and they discovered that slavery was alive and well in Asia, basically they had no choice but to tap into that system if they wanted to trade. So they did. But they knew full well that it wasn't the conscionable thing to do, because that's why slaves were never allowed to return to Holland and be kept as slaves. The same with England. If they landed on European territory, they were automatically freed, ipso facto. Yeah. So that's another reason why not many slaves ended up in Europe.
Particularly for on the European front, I mean, I for Alade, I picked up his book, not knowing who. I picked up his autobiography in a bookstore a few months ago, and his whole life story has been one of the most absorbing, and it's run so contrary to the narrative about slavery that we've been sort of my generation, which is white people invented slavery and are uniquely guilty of it, and it was a universal thing that permeated the whole of white society. And the difficulties and complications, the fact that much of it was introduced from outside, that white people were slaves of Africans for a long time beforehand, Barbary parts, the indemnity for slaves from enslaved status, all of these things erased somehow.
Another very interesting aspect.
From this. Ooh, yeah, another very interesting aspect before we move on to the Griqua.
I live in Japan, and I've spent a lot of years of my life in Japan, and Asia fascinates me because I think what we forget in the West, and I use the West very broadly, but what I mean, I suppose, is Western thinking. But in the Western world, we forget that Asia is really, I think, it's the cradle of slavery. because of the caste system. And the caste system is alive and well in Asia and always has been. And it even existed in Japan until the Meiji period, when it was abolished. Abolished in theory, but of course in practice that's something else. But you have a concept even in Japanese where you have a himing, a non-person. And you've got the analogy where these people were, the leather workers. They were the executioners, and they buried the dead. So they had to deal with the dead bodies, they had to slaughter animals, and they had to execute criminals. Same job that was allocated to the Jews in medieval Europe. As the outsiders, they came in and they were given the dirty work across the river. This aspect is quite fascinating. So even in Roman Dutch law, you have strange precedents whereby sex with a Jew was considered bestiality. Very interesting perception of
good gracious.
But the Dutch, in a sense, imported a lot of Asian practices, like the kampongs in Batavia were based on ethnicity, on religious groupings, and everyone was very much separate and unequal. In theory, separate and equal, but no, never separate but unequal. And the same happened at the Cape.
No.
So you can see them transferring this same kind of system, and it's a bizarre mix, because you've got the Dutch using Asian slavery practices and importing them to the Cape, and at the same time they're applying an old Roman legal slave system on the Germanic common law. So Roman Dutch law is fascinating. I mean, you've got all this Roman law terminology, and they were following the Roman law in terms of slavery to the book. Fascinating how that. So that's why the emancipation was regulated
ancient
in terms
concepts
of
into modern Christianity.
Into modern Christianity. And of course there was the biblical justification too, right, where they could actually say to themselves, well, it happened, so this is not really something that God would object to. So, but as I say, I do feel that the Dutch, I mean, they knew full well that their enslavement of people wasn't exactly kosher or halal.
Yeah.
And this is why
absolutely
you've got a very
Speaking of
interesting...
halal,
Right.
Speaking of halal, the one big thing that I picked up when I was looking this recently, and I was doing a bit of reading for the interview I'm going to have tomorrow, is that a lot of what they call free blacks in the Cape, who are not black African but usually Asian or admixtures, a lot of them own slaves as well, particularly the Muslims.
Yes.
And a lot of the early, like Tuan Guru, for example, owner, big early, and a lot of also notice that this is also something that's missing from the commentary. Although I suppose one of the other sort of mitigating factors is that they weren't allowed to own land, and so their way of producing into.
And that's not true. Free blacks were certainly one of the first registered free blacks at the Cape owned land. He was given land, and guess what? He was Muslim, and he was. His story is fascinating. He claimed to be a descendant of the Prophet, and he was captured. So there was an English prize. They had taken all their Malagasy slaves to St. Helena. And the Dutch, of course, were interested in occupying and controlling St. Helena. So they captured the ship and they captured this Muslim trader. And they, of course, used him for their trade with the slave trade to Madagascar. And in recognition of his loyal services, he was given his first piece of land in Cape Town, even before the Muslim exiles arrived. So land was possible for a free
My goodness.
black. But I think it's a sore point with a lot of the Cape Muslim community. I think it's convenient to blame, to look to the more recent past of apartheid and all the rest of it, and to conveniently forget that most of them descend from slave owners themselves. And there's a lot of romanticism still involved with the Muslim exiles that were sent to the Cape. A lot of them didn't stay. A lot of them went back again. But of course, their slaves stayed behind. That's the point. And I mean, I've researched a particular prince who was he raped a slave woman from Timor, and he was such an embarrassment to the royal family of Ternate that they begged and asked the Dutch basically to ship him to the Cape and never send him back. And of course, he's the founder of the Jonker family. Ingrid Jonker is a direct descendant. And he was a rapist. Now, this is not good information when you want to have positive role models. But unfortunately, our history isn't always nice. And I'm having a lot of problems in getting this kind of information accepted because people really don't want to know. And, the same thing has happened with Saartjie Baartman. You mentioned the Griqua. I had a lot to do with Saartjie Baartman. I actually initiated the campaign. I was the first person to say, hey, she's never been buried. What about the human right to burial? Why is that not on anybody's mind? Why has that never been a concern? And the most outrageous thing for me was she was born in the year of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. This was the great French Republic, post-revolution France, that said you are entitled to be buried. And she's denied a burial in the very country that gave us these wonderful rights, purportedly, because I'm not so sure the French gave us so much in terms of human rights. I think the English have a lot to offer in terms of their own history. They had a revolution 100 years earlier, so I think we should not forget that. But anyway, so Saartjie Baartman has also been called a slave. She never was a slave. In fact, the evidence is quite clear that she was a very, very involved in the theatre troupes of Cape Town at the time. And all her friends were, part of the demi-monde. She was basically, when she died, she had rejoined her old ballet friend, who was the ballet master at the African Theatre in Cape Town. And he was a young Frenchman, Jean Riot. He was a ballet dancer, and he put on very, very extravagant shows at the African Theatre in what is now Heritage Square. And there's so many ironies here, because Heritage Square was originally Hottentot Plain. That was the last residential area of the Goring Haikona, so Crotwas people. That's where they originally used to hang out when they were in Table Bay. So that's the heart of that's the heartbeat of the Hottentot part of Cape Town. And the theatre is built there, now St. Stephen's Dutch Reformed Church. And St. Stephen's Church is important because it's the only Dutch Reformed church that has a saint's name. And it was also used for slaves and mixed race people once after the abolition of slavery. This became a very important focal point for these emancipated people. And a lot of mixed race free people too, who had nowhere else to go except to mix with their own kind. So Jean Riot was the ballet master, and Hendrik Caesar was in the orchestra. And of course, Caesar takes Saartjie to London. When things go wrong in London in terms of being exhibited and the performances, she then ends up with Jean Riot in Paris. But Jean Riot had been at the Cape. He was declared persona non grata by the English governor, by the Earl of Caledon. So he had got drunk with his friends. They had put on some tricolores, French revolutionary flags, and they went apeshit on Stellenbosch, and they actually harassed the Droste. So they did a little march and they paraded. And this, of course, was not good timing, because we're dealing with the French, possible French invasion of the Cape. So the Brits were not happy, and he was then expelled. But at that time, his friends were all begging the governor to let him stay, because he owed all his friends a lot of money, and he had also been in a relationship with a slave woman. So these are all documented, and I've published, but of course, no one wants to look at this because it's uncomfortable. It's like, how can this poor woman had been connected with these people? So it does point to her agency. It does point to her willingness to go. It does point to a very, very interesting woman who it backfired for her. This is the tragic part. It all went wrong. But she certainly could not have been that naive as to not know what she was doing and what she was letting herself in for, at least partially. But, who are we to know? This is the whole point. We need to I always say we need to really, really dredge up the past as much as possible. We have to exhaust the written record, and only then can we perhaps start putting the pieces together. But when people come with these grand narratives like, oh, this is what happened, she was a slave, she was raped, I mean, this is all nonsense. And it's all hyperbole, and it's all very useful in political point scoring. But it's also a huge disservice to the people of South Africa, and it's a huge disservice to Saartjie Baartman. It's a huge disservice to our history, and it should really be called out. So I think you can hear what I'm saying. I feel very strongly about this.
I've never heard of this before. I completely believed the official narrative on Saartjie Baartman.
Oh no,
I had no idea.
I must interrupt you, but the best is when I started the campaign in 1985, and I went to all the newspapers, and I went to France, and I went to the United Nations. I had to go to the United Nations because after petitioning Mandela, who was then the president, there was nothing forthcoming from government. They refused to cooperate. And that forced me to go to the United Nations to then basically out the South African government and force them to take note. And then, of course...
Sorry, just to be clear, what exactly were you attempting to get from the government at the time?
Well, very simple. To get her buried. The point that I wanted to make in my personal capacity was this woman was never buried, ever. And she's been dead for how long? And she's been on display as a dead person, and she's been deprived of the right to burial. And if we believe in these human rights that are so beautifully enshrined in our so-called final supremacist constitution, then we should be following through if we believe in these values. And if we believe in her dignity, then she has to either be buried in France, and the French, we have no choice but to then request the French to bury her, and failing that, to ask them to return her so that we can bury her. And then the next point was she was an embodiment, literally, of so many South Africans. Because the Khoi ancestry runs through the veins of black South Africans, so-called colored South Africans, so-called white South Africans, so-called Afrikaners. Everyone taps into that. And if the country was going to embrace this, coat of arms with the and all the rest of it, looking all PC and all super, fine, then I think it was quite obvious that she needed to come home. But what really baffled me was nobody really thought about the fact that she was never buried. They were more concerned about how she was displayed. And it became more of a feminist issue. And the problem was, this problem started in the United States. It took African Americans to highlight for South Africans what we had failed to do. And then, of course, when it was put to government, they didn't know what to do. So they went quiet, and then they tried to hijack the whole thing by having secret negotiations with the French government, which took 7 years. And of course, they did their level best to exclude all the indigenous groupings. So I then received a legal mandate from the Griqua National Conference of South Africa and from the paramount chief at the time. And I then went to the United Nations armed with this mandate to then put it to the international community. And then, of course, things started moving, because then the government said, okay, we're working on it. But 7 years later, eventually, but a lot happened in those 7 years, because in that time we were pushing, that was me, of course, pushing with the Griqua National Conference. We'd already made treaties with the other indigenous groupings from Namaqualand and from Namibia, who were also at the United Nations. And we were then negotiating with government to try and get recognition of the indigenous people. So the only concession we got really was at that time, the final constitution hadn't been passed yet. So when the final constitution was eventually promulgated, then the recognition of Nama as one of the secondary languages was constitutionally enshrined. So that was one victory. The other victory was the new coat of arms, but tokenist and certainly not with consultation. So very, very degrading and very, very disrespectful. Yeah. My point being that 1913 was no cutoff date. From an international law perspective, we have treaties dating back to 1672, and these all have legal validity. And this is where the United Nations comes in. And you asked a question earlier about the legal. So this is something I can talk for hours on, because I will bring out a paper quite soon. It's one I've been sitting on for a very long time. But the first two treaties that were signed at the Cape in 1672, very, very interesting. So, from a legal aspect, the government's not off the hook. You can't just suddenly say 1913 is the cutoff date and the rest, is of no consequence. And certainly, I think that was the greatest injustice of the new constitution.
Those treaties, what did they pertain to? What are their repercussions for today?
Well, the first two treaties one was signed for the purchase of the Cape of Good Hope, which stretched from, let's say, Saldanha to Hottentots Holland. Well, no, Saldanha would have been to Tygerberg. And then the second treaty was the Hottentots Holland. So the whole Hottentots Holland area then was False Bay and Somerset West Strand, Gordons Bay. These were formally purchased. And it's rather interesting at the timing of it, because it didn't happen in Van Riebeeck's time. It happened much later. And of course, there was a very interesting Dutch admiral who was legally trained. He was an advocate who had studied at Leiden University. And of course, he was the man who basically set everything up and legalized the Dutch residency at the Cape. Because I think the Dutch knew at that point that their right to be there was tenuous. But of course, things had gone too far, because once you get the mixing and the fact that you've got people left behind, it puts a whole new spin on things. For instance, to call you and I settlers is just nonsense. I think settlers should be part of our hate speech, if we are going to have hate speech and criminalize it. If you're going to criminalize, certain words, then I think settler is one too. I reject the term settler for myself. Don't dare call me a settler. Don't ever call me a settler. Call some of my ancestors, some of them settlers. Do not call me a settler, ever. So, this is very, very touchy.
The things that I want to pick up on with you is so the Griqua expansions in the West and the participation waves of the Great Trek. So for anyone who might be cells, how did the Griqua nation found itself, and how did that identity become?
Okay, now very complicated, of course, and so it should be.
Yes.
History's never uncomplicated. The Griqua are, do you recall the rather interesting novel called God's Stepchildren? Do you know the novel, God's Stepchildren?
No, I haven't.
Okay,
well, I know of it. I haven't read it.
Sarah Gertrude Millen, she was a Jewish South African, and she was great friends with Jan Smuts. But she's been totally discredited by the left, politically left, because somehow her books were still considered to be totally racist. But she wrote a number of novels. One was King of the Bastards, which was the story of the man that had the first Tambuki, the first Xhosa, so first Tembu wife. And people like Max Dupree, they've all jumped onto the bandwagon much later and rekindled the story as if they had discovered them themselves. But Sarah Gertrude Millen did it long before these guys. So once again, we've got all this, everyone's vying for a position in the sun, and like, I did it, I saw it, and I discovered it. But Sarah Gertrude Millen's King of the Bastards, very important book, and God's Stepchildren. The Griquas, in my view, were a kind of offshoot of the white colonial, or the whiter colonial community. But I think when you're doing research, people lose sight of the fact that you're dealing with human beings, and human beings don't change. And human beings are not innately good, and they're not innately bad necessarily. But they sure as hell are bad most of the time. And they sure as hell make the same mistakes time and time again. So it's not hard to imagine that when you've got like off-white kin, it's very easy to dissociate yourself from them. It's very easy to do that with your own brother or your sister when they get married to someone you don't like. Two brothers can compete. Cain and Abel is a classic story. They can come from the same parents, but in the end, they can actually drift apart and become a different grouping. So the Griqua are one of those. These are people that were rejected and regrouped, and you've got all kinds of people coming together again. So their history is very, very complicated. And what I'm finding more and more when I study Griqua families is that there's many of them that have names that I can take back to the original white. Now I use the word settler or colonist. Yes, they are also so mixed, and they have white ancestry. And this is the other thing, the Cape Coloured community, because of the recent past, they want nothing to do with their white past. The hurt, the trauma, I get that, but the fact is they have white ancestry, and they're never going to be able to forget that, whether they like it or not. That's real. It happened, and they need to embrace it one way or the other at some point in the future. So, in the Griqua movement away, you find the families, you've got the same families, you've got the Kluti Basters, you've got the Koopmans, you've got all these families that connect to white families, so interrelated. You've got Adam Cook, the original Adam Cook, being a knecht or a farm manager at Stinkfontein, which was the farm belonging to one of the Loopshes up north. And then you can see that when things go wrong, Adam Cook had a fallout with Afrikaner, one of the other Khoi leaders. Ram and his father get banished to Robben Island, and Adam Cook moves off. Basically, not wanted, get out, you're no longer needed, and he finds new pastures. Or he looks for another watering hole, because water, as you know, is so precious. So the contestation is happening all the time, and on different levels, and between all the different groupings. So this is how I think people should start. Well, this is how I'm beginning to see how the Griqua evolved out of the colonization process. So they, of course, they were not, wrapped in some kind of time capsule, and they were forever pure Khoi. No. And when I went to the United Nations, I got this flack from a lot of leftist academics saying, oh, but they're not real Khoi, they are mixed, and they have no right to claim indigenous rights, etc., etc. But this is all detraction, because if you do a study of any of the indigenous groups worldwide, you've got
that sounds like really aggressive racial supremacy to me.
It's awful. It's absolutely awful. And one of the most shocking things I encountered in my life, and I have to share this, I went 3 times to Geneva to the groupings of the indigenous peoples. And you know what I discovered, to my horror? When I was a kid, I used to pretend I was Sitting Bull, and I had my own wigwam, and I waltzed around in a loincloth. Yeah, that's what I did. I hated cowboys and Indian movies. I always felt sorry that the Indians were always being done hard by. I wanted to save them. So I had this, and I was, so when I got to Geneva and I saw the, shall we say, the casino-owning reservationists of the plains of America looking down on us coming from South Africa, and on other indigenous groupings from the Amazon, and the whole hierarchy amongst the indigenous people of who came first to Geneva and who has the right of audience. disgusting. Indigenous, downtrodden people who are putting rank on their own kind, which tells me that human beings never change.
Yeah.
So now I don't have
Yeah.
any romantic ideas about Native Americans. There's some people have said that the Native Americans effaced themselves. They are part of the problem. They are not. They are guilty too of having effaced themselves. They participated in their own destruction, and that's harsh, but it's not necessarily untrue. And it's one of the aspects of the colonization process that we should not be ignoring or should not allow to be ignored. If we are going to be honest, and if we really want to decolonize, and we really want to end trauma.
What that comes out of that, which I've learned from a little bit of the history, is the impact of farming technology, because for hunter-gatherers, the number of hectares required to support any family group hunting and gathering, so land is at a premium.
Yes,
explains why a lot of in America and in South Africa are so extremely violent and cruel. And yes. Also it explains why becoming integrated with culture would have been such a pull.
Another interesting aspect too, there's a common perception that all white settlers got land at the Cape. Not true at all. Not many got land. There were a great many that left the company and became free burghers, never got land, and they were Bywooners on other people's land. And this is a classic example. My fourth great grandfather, my mother's direct ancestor, he was in a pondok at what is now Easterplaat, which is Brooklyn. And Easterplaat says it all. There was nothing on this land. It was a piece of wasteland given to the very rich Van Renen family, who were patricians. They were, living. They had plenty of slaves. My ancestor didn't even own a slave. In fact, he never owned a slave, and half of his descendants ended up on the other side of the color line. They are now Cape colored, or they were classified as such. So his own daughter ended up with a white man founding a colored family, both husband and wife being fully white. This is phenomenal. So they were impoverished, and they were never part of the bigger colonization scheme of here's a farm it, and buy your slaves, and everything's colonially very comfortable. Not the case at all. And I think part of the history, if you look at the farms, had to be large and they had to be managed. And so there were a lot of people managing the buitenplaats, or for the feeding of the livestock, for the meat trade. And then of course you got the families that followed, and they also had large families, so then of course they all ended up being part of the extended family. But once again, you can look at the wealth distribution amongst the free burghers, not equal at all. And you've got your rich families and you've got your poor families, and never the twain shall meet. If there is intermarriage, it's normally if there's bastardy, or something goes wrong, and it's there's some kind of element of shame or improper behavior, then they end up on the other side, or the poorer side. But the intermarriage between the rich and the poor, and the intermarriage between people of slave origin, they tended to, the old Afrikaans expression, soort soek soort. Well, it's certainly very, very palpable in the records. And this explains some of the divisions and some of the redivisions. And, this is happening again. I mean, I think as the national revolution, progresses, you're going to find that the people who have more in common are going to reinvent themselves. They have to. They have no choice. And we are expendable in the grand scheme of things, from the colonial perspective, just like it happened in Indonesia. I think we need to watch what happened in Indonesia, and we need to make sure that the same doesn't happen here. Because you can't tell me we don't have examples to go by.
Your solution.
Sri Lanka is another case in point.
So solution to this potential erasure, which is beginning in the history books and threatens to extend itself to the flesh, your solution would be mainly to bring more light to history as it really, and to bring that into people's awareness.
Well, I think it's a it's fundamentally important, because how else can we find solutions if we don't have the knowledge? We need to at least know what we are dealing with. Finding solutions based on no information, I think, is quite dangerous. And I think it also means that people will give up so much more easily, because they think, well, I am a settler, I don't belong. I should be chased out of the land of my birth, and forget 12, 13, 14, 15 generations of interbreeding with locals, as if it never happened. And I think yes, we need to make the former colonial overlords need to, they've had it too easy. The thing is, the apartheid liberation gave the ANC and all the other liberation movements, the Dutch could kind of, detract from their colonial past by supporting the liberation in South Africa, and then say, oh, well, what happened before that is of no consequence. And I think white South Africans are particularly guilty for not holding the Dutch to account for what happened here in South Africa. And the Brits too. I mean, let's be honest. There's a lot that has to be brought out in the open. Like, what the hell? Why have you dumped us here in the first place? And why are we being blamed for all the crap that you started? Because essentially, the descendants of the slaves and the indigenous people and the former settlers, or the original settlers, are now being blamed holus bolus for everything that happened. And I resent that. I reject it outright. Why must we carry the burden of guilt for what colonially was started by the Dutch Republic? And now, of course, the successors to that is the Kingdom of the Netherlands, including their pieces of property out in the Caribbean, which is still part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And then, of course, there's the British, And, if I can't go back to England because I don't have a grandfather or grandmother who was British born, but I have a great-grandfather, two, in fact, who were, but I'm not included in the deal, then to hell with them. Then they're going to have to be part of the solution. They have to come to the table. So I don't think this is over in terms of, historical, what's the wonderful term, restorative justice? If we want to have restorative justice, then I'm saying we have to do a tabula rasa. We have to go right to the beginning and sort out everything. We need to talk about that. We need to unpack all this history, and then we can decide what we keep and what we throw out. So Cadessa was unfortunately a disaster, and then what followed after Cadessa was even more of a disaster, because in the end it was a deal behind closed doors. And that's why the 1913 date was so unfairly imposed on South Africans, and the indigenous people were left out. And it amazes me that, Cape Coloured people in particular are not incensed by this, and they still support the ANC. I mean, it's outrageous what happened in terms of human rights, just by the very values that it proclaims.
The weird thing is, for anyone who's read a little of the ANC's modern history, this is entirely legal as well. I mean, since the Morogoro Conference in 1968, they sidelined all minorities, Indian, coloured, white, and declared that people can be full members of the ANC because their suffering is special and recompense more than any other group. And of course, then Steve Biko's usual sort of model of blackness, in which the Africans are the most human, Indians, and then the whites. Only unifying with whites can't. This sort of constellation of identities that this concentric circles of humanity that is known as Ubuntu also goes there and is ingrained into the grammar of two languages. And what astonishes me is the extent to which we have managed to maintain ignorance of this fact when the knowledge has been public for a generation at the very least.
Well, hopefully, I would say, I hope it's not too late. I mean, I've been doing this research for 40 years plus, and it amazes me that so late in my life, I'm still having to convince people about things which are, matter of fact to me by now. And I cannot believe that this is part of the problem. New information, when you confront people with new information, they recoil. Somehow it must be in the history books at school, otherwise it can't be authentic or authorized, or it must come from the academy to be rubber stamped, and only then will they give it some attention, perhaps. But so we're still caught up with this, all the new information is not being absorbed, it's not being internalized at all. So I don't know how much noise one needs to make and how much interaction one needs to do to be able to get people to think differently about the past. And it might
Well,
be
I think
too
you
late.
have to already be a fair bit of a revisionist like you and I to actually, I mean, not that I'm a scholar like yourself, but I mean, to have a bit of a revisionist streak in one to go back and look at these things.
Well, you call me a scholar, and I flinch because I went to university. I have 2 degrees. I studied languages, French and English as majors. I did political philosophy. I have a law degree. I'm an advocate. I'm admitted to the High Court. But I tried history at the University of Stellenbosch, and I gave up after 1 year because I was so disillusioned, because I had already been sitting in the archives doing primary research from high school already. So really, I've done it all by myself without them. And I don't want to have any of my research associated with the academy at all. And, I had a very strange, bizarre gathering at the castle.
Yes, it's interesting you say that, because a fair number of people who are using the internet to actually promote independent scholarship. I mean, I know there's a fellow who's a scholar on Russian Soviet history who I follow on Twitter, called Otto Pol, and he looks at the racially policies that Russia used. There's Justin Murphy is now independently funding his own philosophy research, and he's sort of really at the avant-garde of modern Western philosophy at the moment. And so there's you'll find scholars doing this kind of thing, and I think that in many cases I find that they manage to bear the title a lot better than some of the mukhus who taught me at UCT.
Well, when I was studying law at Stellenbosch, there was no. We did a quantum leap from modern Roman Dutch law back to Roman times, and we were studying Latin. We were studying Roman law as it was, but the common law, the Germanic common law, was just completely left out. And then most of the professors were concerned about the purification of Roman Dutch law and to disinvest it of any English contamination. But of course, our procedural law and everything else is English. But there was, this of course never happened as far as they were concerned. So there were, it was a waste of time to even try and get those people to be interested in what about our legal history, like what really happened. So I was so disillusioned after 6 years at university. And as I say, I was at the castle at this gathering of antiquarians and academics, and all toasting the Dutch Queen, believe it or not, which I thought was outrageous, because I don't see why I should toast the Dutch Queen. I owe her nothing. And 2 of them, both doctors, both retired and very old, and they kind of sidled up to me and they said, "Oh, Mansell, ons hoor dat jy eintlik 'n maatie is." Oh, I cringed. It was just, I felt so defiled. And without thinking, I said to them, "Ja, maar hou dit geheim asseblief toch." And then they looked at me like, "Why?" And I said, "Well, actually, I only learnt one thing at Stellenbosch." "Ja?" And I said, "That was to get my education elsewhere." And I regret having said that because it was very hurtful. But of course I got an education, some education from Stellenbosch. I had some wonderful lecturers, and Johan Degenaar in the political philosophy department, a wonderful, wonderful man who changed my life intellectually too. So yes, but certainly, yeah, most of it was from elsewhere. And, for me, when it comes to like a scholarship, when it comes to South African history, I can tell you now that none of the academy have looked at the early period of the VOC. They've looked at the later period because they can read the script. It's not Gothic. It's not 17th century. They've accessed it, and they've cherry picked. And when it comes to the earlier period, they're relying heavily on each other, and they've done nothing. Very little research. And now that's left it wide open for the Dutch to come in. And you at Leiden University, we invite them into our homes in South Africa, and we welcome the colonial overlords. We should be encouraging our own people to research our own goddamn history. Why are these people raining on our parade? I find this incredible. And and a non-white South African.
What do you make of their general attitude? The Dutch scholars who come to research our history. How would you sort of characterize their general approach to things? Because it's not going to be the same as someone like yourself.
Imperious. It's like we can our culture, our language, our history, so we can show you and help you, and be grateful. And also, we are not interested in you white South Africans because you're an embarrassment because you are the white people that went backwards. So let's concentrate on liberation and concentrate on all the real South Africans who are not white. So these people are very difficult to work with, but at the same time they've got free range of our records, and they are doing the publishing, and they are coming up with the stuff. But of course, history is open to interpretation, and we need to interpret our own history as well, and we need to be heard. So I feel very strongly about that. But I'll give you another piece of, because you're at Leiden, I have to share this with you. This little book I'm holding in my hand is a very rare publication. It's called Thomas Basson, English Printer at Leiden. Thomas Basson, I believe, is the founder or the grandfather of the stamfather of the Basson family in South Africa. Basson, he was an Englishman. He was a familist who fled to Leiden, and he became a printer, and he also printed the first English grammar in the Netherlands. So Thomas Basson, 1555 to 1613, English printer at Leiden. He was the printer for the university. And his grandson or great-grandson went to South Africa and married Angela from Bengal, who of course was the third slave to be freed at the Cape and the first non-European woman to be granted landed property, registered in her name, as an unmarried mother with 4 illegitimate children. And then it gets more interesting because their descendant is the last superintendent. Their descendant is the last superintendent at Dejima, Nagasaki, who dies in Japan after being poisoned, allegedly, for having done secret trading with the Satsuma clan and Okinawa. So he gets buried on his way back from Edo, from Tokyo, and he gets an after-death name, a posthumous name, Buddhist burial, oldest gaijin or foreigner grave in Japan. If you ever get a chance, please pay tribute to him because he's one of us. And he did his PhD at Leiden. And guess what his topic was? The right of pagans, as in Chinese and Asians, and the right of slaves to give testimony in a court of law. Very interesting man. He dies, leaves a will and a huge library at Dejima, and his musical instruments. Very, very cultured man, born in Cape Town, descendant of our famous Basson, who goes to Leiden as the printer at the university, and whose grandson or great-grandson marries a slave woman at the Cape. And then we have Wouter Basson, and then we have me, whose grandmother was a Basson, and then we have other many Bassons, all related, descending from the same people. How can it get more interesting than that? Can it?
No, I've been quite rapt to hear these details, actually. I mean, I haven't had much of your blog, honestly, because I only found it. I contacted you the same day that I found your blog.
Oh dear. Okay, so you have lots
because
of really...
it's stunning.
The other most important thing that
I have tons of reading.
The other thing that I would also highlight, which I think is so important, is the two things. One is the two Ethiopian slaves who were at the Cape with Van Riebeeck, who have a vast progeny amongst the white population. And the second point is the famous Griqua train. Anna Beuseken originally wrote her very, very groundbreaking work on slaves and free blacks in the 1976. This book took the historians in South Africa by storm. I remember sitting in a lecture at Stellenbosch, and the docent spent his whole lecture demonizing Anna Beuseken for bad research. But what he really was saying was, I resent the fact that this woman has unearthed the most incredible documents in the deeds office, which were going to be destroyed, but which she and Margaret Cairns saved in the knickers of time and transcribed. And these were all the slave transactions of the Skepenkenisse. So when she brought out her one book on criminal trials, she footnoted a particular trial, but when I looked it up originally, the original papers, I realized why she relegated it to a footnote. The documents were illegible, and the ink had gone through to the other side. Very, very hard to read. I cried, but I made copies and eventually transcribed them. It took me a long time. I cut my teeth on that. That is how I got to learn the Gothic script and really become adept at looking at those records. And my Dutch improved as well, of course. 17th century Dutch, I should say. And then, of course, Anna Beuseken had said she had been sent to the Cape, banished as a convict, but for an unknown crime. Well, lo and behold, stored in the Cape archives is the full criminal record of the trial. And she was pardoned, and she was banished as a company slave. So she basically was a private slave. She had a relationship with a fellow slave from Malabar. She brought him food. He was not very cooperative. He hit the food out of her hand, swore at her, and she turned on him and called him Moerneker. And he hit her and downed her, and she grabbed a cobblestone and she hit him in the gonads, or tried to. So she punctured his bladder, and he died 3 days later. So she was then arraigned for murder and got off on manslaughter and got pardoned by being turned into a company slave and banished to the Cape for life. But it gets more interesting, because at the Cape she gets pardoned a second time, and she gets married to a very important free black, and she becomes the founding mother of the Snymans family. But what's more interesting for me is during the times of political correctionism in South Africa, she's been elevated and she was given the Order of the Dizer. So this criminal woman, role model deluxe, is now one of our celebrated in the pantheon of heroes and heroines of the new South Africa, thanks to my research. I'm happy, but I'm also not happy because I wasn't actually consulted. But, we are so desperate for heroes from the past, and we are so desperate to or shall we say whitewash our or non-whitewash our history, so we have to resort to these kinds of stratagems. It's sad. Why can't we just deal with our history in an open and honest way? I can't tell you how much it irks me and upsets me.
People seem unwilling to sort of swallow dirty and ignominious gets up to. I mean, pretty much the ordinary texture of life doesn't seem to be that virtuous under anybody's roof. The idea that there's any one group that can inherit special guilt in South Africa places is, to me, kind of an absurdity.
Well, I'm going to mention another very scary thing which happened to me here in Tokyo, and I'm still in shock. I was accosted by a very liberal-minded academic Irishman who had been living in England, but then now, attached to some university here in Tokyo. And he was basically saying, well, why are you doing this research? Like, really, is it so important? And, my response was, yes, I like to document each and every individual because I like to think that they all matter as human beings. And since we have the wherewithal in terms of technology to do this, it makes sense to me to actually document each and every person. And when I read a book and read about somebody and they can't tell me where they were born and who their parents were, then I'm disappointed, because that's context. And it helps me to understand John Locke if I know more about his family. But historians have always, they don't like to go into that detail because it's extra sweat and blood and tears. It's time. Research, it doesn't come easy. But his response was, and then I made a strange analogy. I said, I think when it comes to the Holocaust, it must be very helpful now with technology to be able to do the victims, and we can finally do a tally, and we can really know how many people actually died in the gas chambers. It should be possible. And the same for the Anglo-Boer War concentration camps. We now can finally get there with the help of computers, right? And the response I got from this very leftist, very liberal, very open-minded, very progressive, I'd say regressive, but anyway, saying to me, oh no, but you can't do that, because if we do that, then people are going to, they're going to, it's too sensitive, and we don't need to know that. It's like, well, why don't we need to know that? It's not important. Why is it not important? No, because then it's going to be abused and misrepresented by the far right. It's like, excuse me? Your concern is more about stopping the far right and censoring that kind of information for posterity. You want to do that. That's really the most important thing for you? I am stumped. Surely the most important is to know the truth. How many people really died? Who were they? What are their names? And let's...
No, I haven't met anyone over 30 who still counts themselves as left-wing, who's an irrespectable.
Well, that for me was, eye-opener is not even the word, but, I was completely gobsmacked. But not gobsmacked, it's chilling, it's sinister, it's just... I can't believe that somebody would think that way.
Orwellian.
Because the same goes, over the years, I've been trying to, in my own way, do a personalia of every indigenous person that I encounter in the records. So if I have a name of an indigenous person, Bushman or Hottentot or Bastaarde or whatever, that goes into my data bank, and they get a place in my little world because they existed. And hopefully one day more information will come which will contextualize them further. But all is not lost. There's so much you can do to add flesh to those bones and to bring them back as best as you can. But why relegate them to complete oblivion? And another thing that really bothers me, in Japan, Japanese people pray to the ancestors, but the ancestors don't have names. It's just this protoplasmic amorphous blob, right? We pray to our ancestors. Well, how does that help you? I can pray to my particular ancestors, which I think is much more important because I know who they are. And this. So when it comes to African culture too, this thing of our ancestors are speaking. Well, yeah, first find out who they are, then you can talk to them and get them to give you some feedback. Surely that's important. And we live in a day and age.
You might be asking the wrong one.
Yes. And, just the knowledge. We have the knowledge. We have the wherewithal. We have the access. How wonderful is that? So, yeah, I think, there's all kinds of reasons why this has reached the point that it has. I think in the academy, there's always been kind of a snobbishness towards antiquarians. These are old fuddy-duddies who are, lost in their books, and old farts that dodder around collecting weird information that's useless to everybody. But they do the best research. The academics are, always on these trendy bandwagons, like how can we superimpose our latest, fetish on the academic world? And then they all quote each other in some circular joke, and there's no new knowledge coming out of that at all. So, and then genealogists have also, we've got too many hobbyists. And now with the internet, oh God, we've got all these people that are sitting at their computers and, just collecting names and dates and not doing anything except that. So they're mudding the waters and making life really difficult when you want to really identify people. But, so I like to make a distinction between genealogy and a family hobbyist, because they really are different creatures. And then again, the sad thing is most people do genealogy when they retire. I started when I was 10 years old, my first family tree. And I remember doing royal families and thinking, oh God, why am I doing these people? My family's more important. Why the hell should I, spend time on royalty? What about me and my family? So basically what I'm saying is I started ask about face. I started young doing research, whereas most people start when they're retired. And it's too late. But I had the advantage of meeting a lot of old people while very young and documenting their life stories and joining the dots and getting to this, open-ended research backwards. And then I had the benefit of the education of knowing the general history and joining that. So working with two kinds of approaches. And, I use the analogy in Japan. When I was in the embassy, I used to notice how the Japanese, when it comes to detail, can function fully. But when there was a crisis and they had to be thinking on the feet and thinking broadly, the South Africans had to step in. They were much better at handling the bigger picture. The smaller picture, the Japanese notice everything. They don't miss a detail. So the micro and the macro. And, this is so interesting. When you talk to Westerners, they always have the big picture. They see the big picture. They have very little eye for detail. And they always so know-it-all-ish. And it's so irritating. And then you come to Japan and you live here, and these people are so pernickety, so fastidious, that every detail matters, that they forget the bigger world. But if you combine those two approaches, it's very interesting. And that's, what I've been doing, literally, when I've been researching. I'm looking at the bigger picture and I'm looking at the detail. And once again, as the French say, le bon Dieu est dans le détail, or in English, the devil's in the detail. So who's to tell? Is it le bon Dieu or le diable? But whether it's the devil or the good Lord, but
I suppose it depends on the details.
The details, those matter, right? So,
well, thank you so much for coming. This has been eye-opening, actually, and honestly, the dedication you put into what you're doing is honestly moving. It really is an admirable project to do. I think it's really wonderful.
Well, I must thank you, Rob, because I think this is a wonderful platform from what I see already. And I really wish you all the best in the venture, because I think if you can get more and more young people to talk about the pressing issues of the future of the Cape, because it's the Cape culture and the history that is it's under threat, under huge threat, and it needs to be salvaged, saved, protected, embraced, and sooner than later. So if you can, if that's what you are doing, and that's what I'm seeing you are doing, I really would support it, and I would really hope that other people will support you as well.
Thank you very much.
I think you're freezing.